Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, students, wherever you are. This is Mr. McRitchie's AP Macro Videos. In this video, I'll be going over the Loanable Funds Market Graph. So that is our second graph of Unit 4. It is the final thing we're covering in Unit 4 prior to moving on to Unit 5. So I probably won't be posting a video next week. I don't think I have anything I need to cover next week. That's new information because we're doing testing next week over this unit. Some review stuff, some practice stuff before the test, that kind of thing. So we'll have a video next week, and then we have Thanksgiving break, so it'll be about 2 weeks before my next video, but keep an eye out for all that stuff. So, Loanable Funds Market. Now, in the last video you should have watched would have been over the money market graph. Now, this one is similar in that it covers a similar set of circumstances, and its connection to our aggregate demand and supply graph is almost the exact same connection as it was on the money market graph. But there are a few differences, some few rules, and some little more nuanced shifters that we got to be a little bit careful of. So let's start getting into it. Move this over here, pull this slide open, and project. And switch to that. There we go. Okay, so the loanable funds market. Now, this is another market, just like the money market was. That was the market for money. This is the market for loans and loanable money. This time the good is a loan, so this one actually functions very much like a regular supply and demand graph. And by that I mean like supply and demand of a particular good. Just in this case, the good is a loan. The market itself will be based on how much money in the form of a loan consumers, businesses, and the government needs or wants, and that's going to be based on that return on investment. So basically, if businesses, consumers, or the government believe they can get a good deal out of a loan, they'll be more willing to take out a loan. And that'll be sort of the primary function of this graph, is to figure out, okay, at which current equilibrium interest rate, how much money in loans will people be taking out? And by people, it doesn't just have to be consumers. Businesses take out loans all the time, and the government takes out loans all the time. So got to be careful on that part. The graph is a supply and demand graph. Now, something that is, for some reason, cut off on this visual, it's not when I pull up the PowerPoint, but on this visual right now it is that the y-axis here is the real interest rate. So the price on this graph is the real interest rate. I'll move my head a little bit so you guys can see what's on this chunk of it. But it should say real interest rate here. I don't know why it's cut off. It's not when I look at the PowerPoint on my screen, but it is on this projection. So it's real interest rate on the y-axis, and real interest rate is known as the price of borrowing money. That is a difference between this graph and the money market. On the money market, the y-axis was nominal interest rate. On this one, it's real. The reason being is that since loans are taken over a longer period of time, inflation comes into play more often with a loan. So when we're talking about the market for loans specifically, we're going to want to use the real interest rate, as that will be a more determining price for a loan. So real interest rate is what we're going to be using here. Feel free to go back to the Fisher equation stuff for how to find the real interest rate and things like that. But real interest rates are y-axis here. Supply of loanable funds and demand of loanable funds, quantity of loanable funds is the thing. If you're wondering what exactly does loanable funds mean, Mr. McRitchie, that's just money that can be loaned out. Funds being money, loanable meaning it can be loaned out. So it's specifically money that can be loaned out is what we're talking about here. Now, the graph in a little bit more detail. Make myself a little bit bigger here. Okay, there we go. So we have the supply of loanable funds and the demand of loanable funds. This one has the real interest rate written, so it's a little more easy for you to see. And the quantity of loans. There is an equilibrium real interest rate and an equilibrium quantity of loans. Where this equilibrium is dictates the current amount of loans people will want to borrow and what the real interest rate should be in the current present moment. Now, you could also see it as supply of loans and demand of loans, or, and this is a weird one, but it does happen, S lenders and D borrowers. I've seen that visual before, so don't get thrown off if you see different variations of what they write for the supply and demand here. It is actually not a bad idea to use this last one, at least for your own sake, because supply of lenders, demand for borrowers does actually help us think about what things will change this graph. So let's get into the supply and the demand curve and what they really mean. The supply of loanable funds is the amount of loanable money that banks have the ability and desire to lend. Basically, how badly does a bank want to give out a loan? and it'll be based on their desire to loan out money as well as their ability to. If they've got more money, they'll be able to loan out more, so the supply of loanable funds would increase. If banks have less money, the supply would decrease. And that'll look just like any other supply and demand graph will, where an increase on one of these lines will be a rightward shift and a decrease will be a leftward shift. So that isn't a new thing. At this point in the class, we've done enough graphs that you should be getting a little more used to the idea of increasing right, decreasing left, always and forever. The demand for loanable funds, it's very important to make sure that you get this part down, that it is consumers, businesses, and the government's ability and desire to borrow money. It's not just consumers, it's not just me and you getting a loan for a car, it's businesses getting a loan to buy a factory, it's the government getting a loan so they can pay for all of their spending. Okay, those are big things. So if people, businesses, or the government, if any of those entities want to borrow more, demand goes up. If any of those entities want to borrow less, demand goes down. So be aware that it doesn't just have to be consumers, that it's a lot broader than you think. The supply of money in the loanable funds market will be determined by how much money banks have, because banks are the supplier of loans. But the demanders of loans are not just consumers. It's consumers, businesses, and government. Okay, so in this one, I've got a nice little T-chart to help separate our supply and our demand shifters. You can write this T-chart down and keep an eye on it. Make sure you understand each of these, as these will be the things that determine what changes on our loanable funds market graph. So, for demand. The first one, the most common demand shifter, is a change in perceived business or consumer opportunity. Basically, if businesses see that they can make a lot of money right now, they will want to capitalize on that. So they would be more willing to spend and borrow money. So that would increase demand. If they think that things are going kind of poorly right now, they're not going to be as interested in spending lots of money because things aren't going super hot. So demand would fall. Similarly, for a consumer, if they think the economy is doing really well right now, like that now is a very good time to go buy a house, yeah, then the demand for loans is going to go up. Because again, even if the economy is doing well, it doesn't mean I magically have the money to buy a house. Just means that now is a pretty good time to buy because I feel fairly secure in how the economy and my job is doing, and therefore more willing to make big purchases. A second one, which is, we're going to get into this in a lot more depth in Unit 5, changes in government borrowing due to things like a budget deficit and a budget surplus. I'm not going to go into crazy depth here on number 2. For now, the way to think about it is just if the government needs to borrow more to pay for their spending, demand for loans would go up. If the government needs to borrow less because they're spending less, then the demand would go down. This is going to come up in the future when we talk about things like crowding out. So like highlight that one, be aware like this one will be important later. In terms of in Unit 5, this second shifter is going to be a whole thing we got to deal with. Now, supply shifters. Changes in savings behavior is the first supply shifter. The main reasoning here is, where do you save your money? Well, that'd be the banks, right? Banks are where most people save most of their money. So if you're saving more money, then banks would conceivably have more money, which means the supply of loanable funds would grow, because if banks have more money to loan out, they have more money to loan out, which is the supply of loanable funds, the amount of money that banks have to loan out. So if there's more saving, there's more money in banks, banks can loan out more. If there's less saving, if people are keeping less of their money in their bank account and keeping it under their mattress or in a safe in their home or just in the form of physical gold randomly, they decided people like think gold's a thing or something that they want to have, that would all hurt the amount of money that's being held in a bank and therefore decrease the supply of loanable funds. The second one, and this is where kids can get kind of confused. This graph and the money market graph are not the same thing, and the supply of loanable funds and the money supply are not the same thing. However, this gets annoying. When the money supply changes, the supply of loanable funds will change. Here's how. When we were talking about the money market graph in my previous video, hopefully you watched that relatively recently compared to this video, what I mentioned was when the Federal Reserve does monetary policy, it changes the amount of money that banks can lend out, right? And that allows to borrow more and spend more. That was the whole idea behind expansionary monetary policy, was that by increasing the money supply, banks can lend more and we can spend more. By decreasing the money supply, contractionary monetary policy, when you decrease the money supply, people can borrow less and spend less. And there's the idea for this. Because if the money supply will coincide / overlap with the supply of loanable funds, since the money supply includes money in banks, and money in banks is the supply of loanable funds. When I decrease the money supply, that would mean that there's less money in banks, so the supply of loanable funds should also decrease. They will move together. Money supply decreases, supply of loanable funds decreases. Money supply increases, supply of loanable funds increases. So a change in the money supply curve will affect your loanable funds market graph. Specifically, when there's a change in the money supply. 3, this one will also come up more in the future. This will come up a lot more in Unit 6. But for now, changes in foreign investment refers to something called capital flow, meaning the flow of money between countries. The way this will work is when things happen like we start buying more foreign goods, money leaves our economy. There is less money being held in American banks and in American consumers' hands, and it's being held in another country now because we're buying their goods. Our money's going over there. Therefore, we would have less of a supply of loanable funds because money is leaving our economy. Imagine the circular flow model and how that is the money within our economy. If you start buying goods from other countries, that money leaks out of our economy, and that would decrease the supply of loanable funds. This is going to come up a lot more in Unit 6 when we talk about foreign exchange and the trade of different currencies between countries, because that'll affect this a lot. But for now, just know, if money's leaving our economy, less of a supply of loanable funds. If money's flowing into our economy from other countries, a greater supply of loanable funds. And the last one, this was the weird one, I think, for people to figure out. Changes in the expected profitability of loans. This is where the loans are a good, banks are the business logic is most important to understand. That if loans are the product that a bank produces, if a bank thinks they can make more money off of loans, what will they want to do? Sell more. Good, supply goes up. So if they think that loans are more profitable in the near immediate future, they will have a greater willingness to loan out money. The supply of loans would go up. Banks might be willing to do things like borrow from the Federal Reserve to do this. They may encourage people to deposit more of their money in banks through like a better interest rate on a savings account, things like that. But if banks think that loans are going to be exceptionally profitable, they would want to loan out more. And if they think loans will not be very profitable, they won't want to loan out very much, so the supply would decrease. So for that one, you've got to just put the logic in your brain of banks are a business, loans are their product. The profitability of loan would be like the profitability of any product. They want to sell the thing when the thing is the most profitable. They want to give out loans when loans are the most profitable. That's the logic for the last one. These are basically all of the shifters. You can go down a rabbit hole of like a lot more things that could technically affect this graph, but the basic idea for demand is it's going to be based on borrowing. If there's more borrowing, there's more demand. If there's less borrowing, there's less demand. Supply will be based on how much money banks have to lend. If banks have more money to lend out, supply goes up. If banks have less money to lend out, supply goes down. So if they're giving you a scenario for this graph, they're saying, hey, what happens to the loanable funds market graph if you've got to go down to two sort of breakdowns? Does this affect borrowing, or does this affect banks' amount of money? How much money banks have and how much people want to borrow. Those are the two things that it can be affecting. If it's affecting borrowing, how much people want to borrow, sick, demand shifter. If it's affecting how much money banks have, bang, supply shifter. Example. Let me move my thing down here. People get more nervous about getting robbed in their homes. Say there's an uptick in robberies nationally. Don't know why that's happening. It's random. I'm making up the example. Because of that, we decide to save more for money in banks because those are less likely to get robbed than your house. In this example, I'm saying that home robberies are going up. Okay, well, if I'm nervous about getting robbed at my house, I store more money in the banks. So if I'm going down the rabbit hole of borrowing and money in banks, are my two things, money in banks is going the hell up. People are saving more money in their bank, so banks have more money. That's a supply curve shifter. I wrote the lenders and borrowers thing to kind of help me there. If it affects lenders, it's a supply shifter. If it affects borrowers, it's a demand shifter. This will affect lenders quite a bit because more money is being saved in banks. So the supply will go up. If supply shifts to the right here, you're going to see a lower real interest rate. That should logically check out because if banks are going to have more money to lend out, and we want loans the same as before, because nothing here says I want to borrow more money or less. Okay, if we want loans the same and they are going to have a larger amount of them to give out, they're going to have to start charging less for it. The same as any product, that as they produce more and more of the product, the price of it starts to fall. Same idea here for loanable funds market, that as they are making more and more of a thing, the price will start to fall. And the quantity will eventually go up, because as that price gets lower, people will be like, oh, sick, loans are cheaper now. I might go start getting a loan out. That sounds pretty cool. Second example. The Federal Reserve raises the reserve requirement. But Mr. McRitchie, this is a monetary policy. This is the wrong graph. No, it's not. Because in the supply curve shifters here, money supply is the thing that affects this. So if it affects the money supply, it also affects the supply curve here. Let's go through the logic. The Fed raises the reserve requirement. What the hell does that mean? It means that banks have to hold on to more of people's deposits. They can't lend out as much. Wait a minute. That's it. They can't lend out as much. Banks can't lend out as much. Can't lend out as much. Can't lend out as much. Supply goes down. Because now, if they've got to hold on to, say, 80% of your... say they have to hold on to 20% of your deposit as opposed to 10, they can now lend only 80% of your deposit as opposed to 90, meaning they can lend out less. So there's less money that can be lent out. The supply of loans, or the supply for lenders, is decreasing, which will lead to a higher interest rate, because if banks have less to lend out, they'll start charging more for loans because they become more scarce. Fourth example. Businesses see an expected increase in the rate of return on their investments. Okay. Saying that businesses are seeing a lot of profits. Okay. Are businesses a borrower or a lender? Businesses are a borrower. Remember that it's consumers, businesses, and the government who can borrow money. So they are a borrower. So let's think if this will affect their behavior or if it will affect lenders' behavior. Well, if I'm a business and I think that I can make more money on my investments, I'll want to invest more. And if I'm a business and I'm investing, that means I'm spending more money. How do I magically spend more money that I didn't have before? I borrow it. So there's a demand for borrowers change. Borrowers will want to borrow more. This is a borrower, a business, that will want to borrow more money after this statement. Is they're going to make more money off their investments, they're going to want to capitalize on that. They'll spend more to do so. Borrowing will increase as a result. If people are borrowing more money, banks will start charging more, the interest rate will go up, but if people want more loans, they will take out more loans, the quantity would go up. And here is 4 last ones to go through yourself, to just see if you're getting what the heck is happening here. I have once again neglected to have my pen open when I'm doing this. I literally forget every time. If these videos were popular, this would be a meme. They're not, so it's not. But if they were, that would be a meme at this point. So, go through these 4 scenarios, try and figure out what happens on the loanable funds market graph, what will happen to real interest rate, and then think, based on the notes from the last video, what will happen to aggregate demand as a result of the change in interest rate. Interest rate's going to change, real interest rate will change. What will happen to aggregate demand as a result? Okay, ready, steady, go. And pause the video so that you have time to do that. And we're back. So, scenario 1, economic optimism causes consumers to begin buying more real estate. Okay, we're feeling comfortable with the economy, we'll be making bigger purchases. Is this a lender thing or a borrower thing? Well, consumers are a borrower. That's sort of my key word that I'm looking at there. Consumers are a borrower and they're buying more real estate. So borrowing should go up, right? There should be more borrowing, which means on my loanable funds market graph, there should be an increase in the demand. I'm going to put L for loans. Increase in the demand for loans, or LF is one that I like to do a lot, so I never get confused. The demand of loanable funds is going up. People will want to borrow more so they can spend more. If the demand goes up, and you can draw each of these if you want, but I also use my finger graph for this because this is a normal looking supply and demand graph. If my demand goes up, which this is my perspective, demand goes up, then the real interest rate should rise. And if interest rate goes up, what happens to aggregate demand? Well, if interest rates are higher, investment spending should go down. So that should decrease AD. Now again, I specified in this column that it's due to the change in interest rate. This is not what happens to aggregate demand in this statement. This is what happens to aggregate demand as a result of the change in interest rate due to that statement. It's a different question. Got to be very careful with what they are asking about. Okay. 2, as Americans purchase more foreign good, financial capital, money, flows out of the United States. So money is leaving our economy is what's happening in 2. Lenders are borrowers. While this is still a purchasing thing, foreign goods aren't a thing that I typically need a loan for. Buying an imported good from China isn't something I typically have to borrow money to do, so that's not really a borrower thing. But if money is leaving our economy, capital's flowing out, this is the foreign investment thing. If money is flowing out of our economy, there should be a lower supply of loanable funds because there's less money in our economy, so banks will have less money to lend out to people. If the supply goes down, interest rates will also climb because if banks have less to lend, then they'll start to charge more for loans. And if those go up, AD will fall yet again. In this case, compared to number one, aggregate demand would go down regardless of the timing of the question. Because in this, it's saying that we're importing more, and imports do decrease aggregate demand. As a result of my graph, aggregate demand does decrease anyway. So in this case, it didn't matter which part of the question they would have asked about, because in both situations, it actually would have decreased aggregate demand. That is, what I'm telling you there is that it's not a consistent thing. It's a situational thing. So you've got to read each question carefully and see what they're asking about. In each of these, down this column, it's always saying due to this column. So for what happens to aggregate demand, I'm looking strictly at the column to the left of it. 3, the government borrows less as a result of a more balanced budget. Okay, the government's borrowing less. There's less borrowing. I mean, that is a little more straightforward. Since the demand curve is the behavior of borrowers and they're borrowing less, there should be less borrowing, so demand is going down. Because the government can borrow too to pay for things. If they have a more balanced budget, they won't have to borrow as much. They're doing better. Demand for loanable funds goes down. If there's less of a demand for loans, interest rates will fall. Actually lead to an increase in aggregate demand. Because if interest rates are lower, investment spending can start to pick up because businesses will be able to borrow and spend more, so AD climbs back up. Then 4, banks expect loans to be more profitable in the future. Okay, immediate future, so like right now. Like tomorrow is the immediate future. So immediate future isn't really a thing that super matters. I'm gonna kind of ignore it. Banks expect loans to be more profitable. Okay. Well, if I'm a bank and I think loans are gonna be more profitable, what am I gonna want to do? Lend more. Cool. Lending, supply curve, more increase. So increase the supply of loanable funds. If banks are lending more, then they will start to charge less for loans over time if we want loans the same, which will lead to an increase in aggregate demand. Because as lower interest rates will allow for businesses to borrow more and spend more, AD will go up. That's the idea here. So, for the Loanable Funds Market Graph, sort of the key takeaways are, it's a supply and demand graph, like a regular one for the most part. It's just the good we're talking about is loans. And you can think of it as the supply and demand of loanable funds, the amount of money that can be loaned out. You can think of it as the supply and demand of loans. Frankly, you can think of it as the supply of lenders and the demand of borrowers for loans. That also all kinds of works. Make sure you've got that list of shifters down, but the ultimate thing at the end of the day is if people want to borrow more, demand goes up. If banks have more to lend, supply goes up. If people want to borrow less, demand goes down. If banks have less to lend, supply goes down. That's kind of it on the end of the day. It does still affect the aggregate demand curve because interest rates still get affected here. Therefore, the interest rate and investment inverse relationship comes into play. So that will still matter. And importantly, changing the money supply does also change your loanable funds market graph. So something like none of these, but the one that I had a couple slides before where was the reserve requirement, that would change my money market graph as well as my loanable funds market graph and my aggregate demand aggregate supply graph. That would change 3 graphs. I could draw that on 3 different graphs, what's happening there. So be careful about that, okay? We'll be messing around with these multiple graph shifters and practices the next couple of days before we do our test in my class. So keep an eye out for that. You might be asked to draw more than one graph on a question. That's not crazy. That is okay. Not typically a multiple choice, but on FRQs, that is a very frequent FRQ type. But that should be it for the loanable funds market. Again, feel free to go to ACDC Economics on YouTube for shorter videos that might review and or recap this. There are a couple of things that were not covered in this video that have to do with this graph. They are things that are in future parts of the course. Those things are, in case you're someone who's curious, the crowding out effect, which will come up in Unit 5, our next unit, which has to do with the government borrowing thing, why they're doing it, and how that affects us. And the second is the capital flow thing, which is the financial investments from other countries. That will come up for us in Unit 6 when we start talking about the foreign exchange market graph and how your currency value changes and how that affects where money's going internationally. So those two things on this graph are things that we're going to circle back to later in the course. I might sprinkle them in a question here or now, but I won't be going in depth on like the things that are weird about those, which there are some things that are weird about those that we can't really explain just yet because we haven't explained the other part of those things that come up in those units respectively. So that's it for the Loanable Funds Market Graph. Make sure you know the shifters of those graphs and what it means to look at it, but that should be it for today. Best of luck, everybody. Good one.